First of all, thanks. This was a really insightful talk. Secondly, I don't know, I guess analogous to crypto, sort of your tail risk is catastrophic, right? And then how you outlined is effectively, it's a lot of execution risk. So I'd be curious to learn more about sort of the value and the culture you're trying to build from day one, and sort of the operating principles you've really trying to follow since, and also how that has manifested and changed over time, and sort of the lessons you learned from that.
Sure. So kind of culture and company and lessons learned along those lines. So it was, a method of thinking I find very helpful in this is what I call reverse historical reasoning, which I really need to coin a new name for. But here's the idea. Imagine yourself in the future, and the year is like 2040 or 2050, and you're reading the history books about how the world made the transition from subsonic to supersonic. And just you take everything that we all know from the history of business and tech and the environment we swim in and the success stories we're familiar with, and say, well, how do you think that story goes? Well, do you think it's like after a century Boeing got off their butt and did it? I mean, probably not. It's probably somebody from outside the industry. And what would the attributes of their story look like? Well, they have to be highly perseverant because people are going to call them crazy. They'll have to, what they're doing is technically hard, and so they'll need a team that's both brilliant and committed very long range. A team that'll see it through for basically the decade that it'll take from founding to really having success. And as you start to fill out that story arc, you find that your intuition brings you a lot of the things that are going to be the key elements of success. And if you're forgetting that you're part of this, you can divorce your ego from it, and you can divorce yourself from your insecurities about what you personally think you can and can't do. And then you look back at this story arc and you say, well, that's called my strategic plan, and now I get to do my best to live into that success story. But so one of the elements of that, coming back to your question, that was evident from the moment of founding was that team and culture were going to be paramount. And we wrote our first culture doc when it was a 2-person company, and we were very deliberate about what we thought made for good hires. And we looked first and foremost for strong mission alignment. And I tell to this day every single person who interviews with the company, don't come unless you really, really, really believe in the vision, unless you personally really want to make supersonic flight mainstream. Because if you don't, and you're sane, you're going to give up along the way. This is really hard. And some people actually opt out at that point. As cool as supersonic jets sound, it's not actually for everybody. And so you filter for a high degree of mission alignment. And we filtered for people who, in the early days, we filtered maybe too strongly for people who loved airplanes. And we looked for people who were first principles thinkers, who could understand the why. And if you didn't know the whys, you didn't get hired. My favorite interview question was, teach me something. And if you couldn't teach me something, you didn't get a job. And for the most part, that has served us really, really, really well. If I say what are some of the lessons learned, some of those early cultural definitions allowed us to inadvertently pick up some anti-diversity bias. So for example, we had in the early days we said we look for people who are builders, and that meant you got something cool in your garage, your hands-on. And we hired somebody who had held the world record for the fastest electric pickup truck that they'd build himself. We had 2 people who had built their own computer-controlled milling machines in their garages, and it was super cool. And then we realized at some point that's an experience that's a filter that accidentally overly selects for men, and we were missing out on some good people because of that. And so we fixed that, and we realized well, why do we care about the builder thing? Well, actually, it turns out the builder thing is a proxy for people who take initiative. You don't want people who are kind of 9-to-5ers, you kind of turn the crank and they do what they need to do. You want people who are overflowing with productive energy, so much so that they go build stuff in their own time. But it turns out when you have that perspective on it, you look for a lot of other signs of taking initiative. And so we ended up changing the focus to be on that. And then we've still got more work to do on diversity. It's tough. But we bumped and turned the corner on it at that point. That was one of the biggest lessons learned in culture building.